Well, good afternoon, First Woodcut Scouts. It's good to be with you again on this bank holiday Monday. I imagine as it's a lovely sunny afternoon that many of you are probably outside in your gardens with your parents and such like. So you probably won't be watching this live, but if not, I hope you watch it later on. But I see the Styles have just joined us. Welcome, lovely to see you. But if you're not watching this live, I hope you've had a great bank holiday Monday and you've enjoyed the sun, had some fun with your parents and such like. So this is going to be part 2 of the photography badge. Last time we just sort of did a bit of an overview of what the badge was going to involve. We looked at different types of cameras, film cameras, digital cameras, some of the historical cameras, and we talked a little bit about the history of photography, how it began and how it started. Now I hope over the past week some of you have managed to get hold of a camera. Maybe you've got your own camera already, or you've been using a camera on your phone, or maybe your mum or dad have lent you their camera, or you've been able to use their camera. You might also have one of these things that uses this type of film. This is a Instax printer. It prints up little photographs, and I know some youngsters do have these Instax printers, and they're great, or Instax cameras, which you can use as well. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see you all joining us. So this afternoon we're going to just go into a little bit more detail. I hope, as I say, over the past week you've been getting to grips with whatever camera or cameras you've managed to get hold of, and just been having a go and going out and taking a few photographs. I've bumped into a few people as I've been going on my walks who I know have been taking photographs. I want you to keep on taking pictures. Though the end result is to produce a set of black and white photographs, in order to do that you need to take lots and lots and lots of different black and white photographs, and then in a couple of weeks time when we finish this series of videos, you're going to need to then choose your best photographs, and I will explain how you can email those to me or upload them to me, and then we're going to create a virtual gallery online is what we're going to do. Okay, so I have put, and in fact what I'll try and do now is let's see if I can. I'm not sure whether I can actually put a picture on there. So I have on the Scout site, if you look at the little advert I did put for the photography session, I have included these things as JPEGs, and I've also asked Skip to email them out to you. So you will get these. If you haven't got them already, you will get them eventually. And they're just a couple of little handouts that explains a bit about what we're doing today, just to sort of help you with that. But I'm going to go through them first of all, so you get some idea. Good afternoon, Skip. Lovely to see you. Right, camera controls. I'm going to use my Leica here, which is quite an old camera. This one's about 20 years old. But it's easy to do because all of the controls, it's a film camera, so it's not digital, it has a roll of film in, but all of the controls and the dials are on the top, so it's quite easy for me to show you the different controls that a camera has. Now, in photography, it's all about controlling light, how much light either hits the film or the digital sensor if it's a digital camera. And really there's 3 ways in all cameras, both digital and film, of controlling light. The first is your shutter speed, and this dial up here, if I put that up to the camera there we go. This dial up here has a whole load of numbers on it, and that controls the shutter. This goes from B, which is a bulb setting. That means I can hold the shutter open as long as I want. Then it goes 1 second, 2 seconds. It goes all the way up to 1,000th of a second. And basically every camera inside the box here has something that goes like that, and it'll open it up, let the light into the film or the digital sensor, and then close it down again. And the speed of that, doing that, is basically your shutter speed. Okay, so that's your shutter speed dial. And to say on an old camera like this, it's normally on the top. The other way that you control light is what's called your aperture dial. And on a lot of cameras here, let's pop this up to the lens. I don't know if you can see these numbers here. This is on the lens. And basically you have a set of numbers that sometimes go from about 1 right through to something like 16 or 22. And apertures are known as f-stops. They're called f-stops. And what happens here, and it's this I'll actually show you. If I take this lens off this camera, the aperture, I'll hold that up for you. If you see this here at the top, basically the aperture is the hole in the lens through which the light goes, okay? And it's a little bit what we call counterintuitive. The smaller the number, like f.28, the bigger the hole, the more light gets let in. The bigger the number, the smaller the hole, and the less light get let in. And that's how we control the light. And if you look at this lens here, if I take this lens cap off, this is quite a good lens, because if I get this right here, if I turn this, can you see that hole closing up? Okay, that's called the iris, okay? And that basically is your f-stops. By dialing that in, that's f22. And as I go right out and open it up, that is f1.1. So that's how you're controlling the light, okay? And all camera lenses on digital or film cameras will have that. And that's how you control light going onto your film. The final way that you control light is by what they call your ISO setting, or ISO. And years ago, when you used to buy boxes of film like this, on the film it would actually say where the film speed is. So I don't know if you can see there, it says 36 exposures and it's got the number 200. So that tells me that this film has a 200 ISO. And basically that ISO tells me how sensitive this film is to light, okay? And when you used to be able to buy lots of film ISO used to go from about 50 ISO probably right up to 32,000. You could get some very specialist films that were faster, but normally it was ISO 50 through to 32,000. Most of your mums and dads will probably be used to taking pictures with an ISO of 100 or 200, or maybe 400, but 100 or 200 was normally the standard one. Now, when they invented digital cameras, they carried on with this setting. And if you remember last time, of course, digital cameras don't have film. They have that sort of purpley thing that you can see in there is the sensor. And what you can do is you basically can make that sensor through technology, through algorithms and the computer. You can make that sensor as sensitive to light in different ways. And on this digital camera, this is a modern digital camera, but it has old-fashioned dials. Up here I have an ISO dial. And this dial again goes from about 160. And one of the amazing things about digital cameras is the ISO is really high. So this one goes to something like 250,000. So it means you can almost take pictures in the dark with a digital camera, which you couldn't do with a film camera. Now, on the digital cameras your parents might have, if you've got like a Canon or a Nikon camera, those dials and things probably won't be on your camera. You might have the thing on the front of the lens, what I showed you, the aperture, but your shutter speed dial will be in your menu at the back. And normally digital cameras have these little wheels at the back of the camera. On this one's got one at the front of the camera. And normally what you can do is you can set your camera to control your shutter speed and sometimes your aperture using these little wheels, okay? So if you've got a Nikon or a Canon SLR camera, then that's how you're going to do it. If it's yours, you might already know how to do it. If it's your parents', you'll need to ask them and they will show you. But that controls your shutter speed and your aperture. The ISO, again, on a digital camera, you set using the menu, okay? And sometimes you can just put it on auto, but if you have it, most digital cameras, you have it set around about 400 ISO camera. With film cameras, It doesn't tend to do it automatically. There's normally a dial on the back somewhere where you have to sort of dial in, tell the camera what film speed is there, so the light meter knows what's happening. Okay, so that's the three things on all cameras and with all photography that controls light. That's your shutter speed, your aperture and your ISO. And how you vary those gives you different effects. So let's start with shutter speed. If you remember, that's the thing that goes and lets the light in. Now this is on the handout sheet here. Now basically this is showing shutter speeds going from half a second to 1/500th of a second. That's pretty fast. And the rule of thumb is, like, if you're doing sports photography, like somebody running, and you want to freeze the action, you want to freeze it still, you need a high shutter speed. So you'll need something like 1/500th or 1,000th of a second, or even a bit higher than that. And again, what's great about digital cameras is sometimes they go up to 1/8000th of a second, so you can freeze things really easy. So for sports photography, or for example, let's say you wanted to take a picture of your dog running in the wreck or something like that, and you want to freeze your dog jumping or something, you're going to need a high shutter speed. Okay, so you tend to use that for action and sports photography. Down the bottom here, you can see the image is a bit blurred. Well, that's what would happen if you took a photograph of somebody running using one of these low shutter speeds. But people who do what we call landscape photography, which is what I do, we tend to use these low shutter speeds. Okay, and the reason is is that sometimes you might want to make things blur deliberately. So for example, if you were taking pictures of waves or running water on a stream, you can make it look in the photograph like the water is moving, and on the sea it goes really milky and smooth. And for that you need to have a long, what they call a long exposure, so you have to have a slow shutter speed, or you can make the clouds blur as the clouds move with a long shutter speed. If any of you have tried any sort of astral photography, and I know we were making telescopes in Scouts recently, again you would use a long shutter speed because there's not a lot of light coming from the stars, so you have to have the shutter open for a long time for the light to get to the film. Okay, so that's the rule of thumb. If you want to freeze the action, you need a fast shutter speed. If you go in landscape photography and you want to sort of, and in low light conditions where the light is low, then you're going to have a slower shutter speed. Okay, and you can play around with that. So back to aperture again. We've got this graph here. So the thing with aperture, what it controls, it controls the light, as does the shutter speed dial, but aperture controls what we call depth of field. Okay, and basically that means that if you imagine my eyes and nose is the point where the camera focuses, you need to work out how much of the background is going to be in focus and how much of the foreground is in focus. Now the tiny little lens that's on my computer, it's sort of set to infinity, so virtually everything you can see in the picture here is in focus. But actually sometimes you might want to change that a bit. So for example, if you're taking a portrait, imagine you're taking a portrait picture of me now, you can see behind me that my office here is very cluttered. Now if you use a wide aperture, if you have the aperture wide open here, the hole bigger, all of that stuff behind me, it will go out of focus, it will be blurry. And particularly then if you take somebody's portrait standing, say, by a tree or behind a bush, it will make that go all nice and blurry and green. So all that will be in focus is the person's head and shoulders, which makes for a good photograph. Okay, so that's called we call that a wide aperture, and that is a narrow depth of field. Okay, but if you're doing landscape photography, say you want to take a nice view of the chase or something when you go on a walk, landscape photographers want to make sure as much of the scene is in focus as possible. So let's say you had a gate, or there was a lamb or a sheep in the foreground, you want to make sure that's in focus, but you want to make sure the trees and the hills in the distance are also in focus. Then you would use a large number like f16 or f22, which makes the hole smaller, and that will mean everything will be in focus. So that's aperture and depth of field, and it's worth having a play around with your cameras, experimenting. So experiment with the shutter speed, how fast it will go, how slow it will go, and the different effects you can get. And you can experiment with aperture as well and see how much is in focus behind and in front of a subject, and by changing the different settings on the aperture. Now, just one little tip. When you're hand holding a camera, even if you're very young, there's only so much we can hold a camera absolutely steady. And the rule of thumb is, with the shutter speed at the top, is you can really only hand hold a camera to what we would call 1/60th of a second, 1/60th of a second. So if your numbers on your shutter speed go below 1/60th of a second, like if you get 1/13th, 1/30th, 1/15th or 1/8th of a second, what will happen is if you take a picture hand holding the camera, you don't realise it, but your hands are moving just a bit. And if you remember what happens in that picture there, it goes blurry. So what will happen is you'll end out with a blurry, slightly out of focus picture. So when you're using those slow shutter speeds, what you have to do is put your camera on a tripod. You have to put your camera on a tripod. And we'll talk about camera accessories and other bits a bit later on. Okay, so that's really aperture and shutter speed. The other way you can cheat is the ISO. Now, coming back to the ISO, if I get my little sheet here somewhere, on the other sheet I've got a sort of a diagram here that you can look at. Now, with a low ISO, everything will be quite slow. The bigger the number is, the more sensitive to light the film or the digital sensor is. So what you can do is, if there's not very much light around, like at dawn, what you can do is increase that number. So you can have an ISO 400 or 800 or 3200, okay? And that will mean that your shutter speed will be above 1/60th of a second. So that's how you can alter the ISO. On a digital camera, if you set your ISO to auto, then its computer brain will do it all for you, which makes life a bit easier. Okay, so that's how your ISO is affected with things. So that's the three things that control light into a camera: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now, on your cameras, your modern digital cameras, you will find that there are normally 4 settings on a camera, okay? And the 4 settings that you will find are P, which is called program mode, okay? Now, sometimes on modern digital cameras, like a Nikon or a Canon, up the top here, there will be a little dial. And on it, you will see something like P, A, S, and M, okay? So the P is for program mode, and that basically means the camera's electronic brain will do everything for you. It will decide the shutter speed, it will decide the aperture, and it will decide the ISO to get the right amount of light onto the digital sensor to get a really good exposed picture. So if you're absolutely new to photography, P, program mode, is not a bad place to start until you get used to holding the camera and focus and bits and pieces like that. The next letter you'll find is A, and that stands for aperture priority. Now that means what happens is the camera's little brain will automatically choose the shutter speeds, but it does mean that you can set the aperture. So that gives you control of that focus, how much is in focus in front of the subject and behind the subject. And if you remember, as I said, if you're taking a portrait, you want those numbers to be low, about 2.8 or 4. And that means the camera will work out what the shutter speed needs to be. And if you're doing a landscape, you want to get that right down to 16, f16 or f22. And again, on aperture priority, the camera will work out the shutter speed. Now, I was a professional photographer, but I often use my camera, unless it's completely manual, in aperture priority, because I feel that gives me the most creative control. So lots of people boast that if you're to be a proper photographer, you have to use the camera completely on manual. Well, that's nonsense. Okay, lots of professional photographers use cameras completely on automatic sometime. It's just about how much control you want to have over a subject. So aperture priority, setting your camera to A, is another good way to start, because the camera will worry about the shutter speeds, but you can control the aperture and practice getting the different effects. The next setting is S, and that's shutter priority. Now that means that you can set the shutter speed. So back to trying to photograph your dog jumping in the park and you want to freeze your dog. What you can then do is set the camera to a high shutter speed. So you can set it to a 1/500th of a second, or 1,000th of a second, or 2,000ths of a second. And by setting that, it then means that the camera will set the aperture. So you'll be able to freeze your dog. So that's S, that's shutter priority, okay? And then the final setting that you'll find is M, and that's where everything is completely manual. So you will have to set your shutter speed and your aperture. And in order to do that accurately, most cameras have what we call a light meter inside. So as you look through the viewfinder, or you look at the digital thing on the back, there's normally either a little arrow or lights or a little line that tells you what the light meter reading is and where it needs to be. In old-fashioned cameras, you used to see a plus and a minus, and a little dial used to go up and down like that. And what you had to do was balance everything out so the little pointer sat in the middle. And that's how you use a light meter. Now, I suggest you don't try that at first. Have a go on program mode, have a go on aperture priority, and then shutter priority. And as you gain in confidence, then you can learn to use your camera completely manually. The great thing about digital is, of course, you're not going to waste any film. You can take as many pictures as you want. It doesn't matter if they go wrong. That's a really good way to learn. With film, that gets very expensive. So that's the good thing about digital cameras. So either program mode, aperture priority, shutter priority, or completely manual. So you can have a go with those, okay? So over the course of this week, try those different modes and try some different subjects and experiment the different effects that you'll get. I think you'll be quite pleased at what you can do. And remember, as with everything, practice makes perfect. Now, the final thing I want to talk to you today really is about composition and particularly black and white photography, because the project we're doing is going to be black and white, and taking black and white pictures, you just have to think in a slightly different way. But first, let's talk about composition. And those of you who've maybe done art at school or college, you might know a little bit about this already. So sorry if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but it's always a good way to recap. Now, artists and photographers, they often use a thing called rule of thirds. And this basically means like this. If you imagine that is your the back of your camera screen, or the viewfinder in your camera, it's a bit like a noughts and crosses grid. So what you do is you divide up your viewfinder in this way into sort of these 9 segments, okay? And why it's called the rule of thirds is because these lines here, this one, and then this one, and then the horizontal ones, that one and that one, they intercede at a third, okay? Now, normally when we take a photograph, our natural thing to do is to put the subject here, right in the middle. Okay, so we take a picture and put the subject right in the middle. And sometimes we might also be too far away, so it means the subject in the middle is a bit small. When you use the rule of thirds, the idea is you don't put the subject in the middle, you move it to where one of these lines is. Okay, so let me give you an example. Here is a sheep or a ram up on a hill. Now, rather than put the ram right in the middle here, this photographer has put it on this third here. In fact, what he's done is he or she has put it on 2 thirds. Okay, so they've put it on the vertical third and the horizontal third. And actually, can you see that makes a much nicer composition, because you can see the main subject, which is the ram, but you've also got some idea about the landscape that the ram happens to be in. and these clearly up on high, and then you've got these beautiful clouds in the background. So that is the rule of thirds, and it's worth experimenting with that. Try and avoid putting your subject right in the middle. Sometimes you will do that with a portrait or something, but actually using that rule of thirds, you'll get much, much better pictures. And the other thing is to think about filling the frame. What we often do is we stand too far away from our subject, so that when we actually look at our pictures, everything looks very small. So you've got to make sure you've got lots of interesting things, because if you just had the sheep, if you just had that ram, he's actually quite small in the whole of that picture. But adding the rocks and making sure the clouds are there, that's filled the frame with interesting things, okay? The other thing about composition is, of course, when you make a painting or a drawing or a photograph, it's only two-dimensional. Okay, as human beings, we see in 3D because we've got two eyes, so we can sort of work out distance, how far away things are. So what you need to do is trick the viewer into thinking that a two-dimensional image is actually a three-dimensional image. And the way you do that is by putting interest into the foreground and in the background, or for example, you use something to lead the eye in. So if you're out and about this week taking photographs, for example, you might be following a footpath, and what you could do is use the footpath or the fence that goes along the footpath, and if the fence sort of comes in at one of these corners and sort of makes its way up into the middle, that will help lead your eye in to the picture, okay? Or it's having some interesting stuff in the foreground. So in the foreground here we've got the rocks. In the middle ground, the main subject is the ram, and then in the background we've got the cloud. So it helps to lead the eye in, and what it does is it creates an illusion in our brain that what we're seeing is actually three-dimensional. But of course it isn't. It's only two-dimensional because it's on a piece of paper. So that's really the two golden rules of composition. Use the rule of thirds and experiment with that, and try and put things into your picture that make sure they fill the frame, it's nice and interesting, but there's things in the foreground and the background that will lead your eye into the photograph. So try experimenting with some of those as well. Now, some of you might not have the type of cameras that we've spoken about, and you're just using a camera phone, but that is fine, okay? Because a lot of these things you can actually do on a camera phone. Now, for example, I just downloaded an app. I've got an iPhone, but all of these apps, whatever sort of phone you've got. So I downloaded an app just before we started, which was called Pro Camera. I'll just switch it on, and there it is. And even though that's on a camera phone, on a telephone, it's got all of the settings here. Okay, so it has aperture, shutter speed, ISO. I can manually focus if I want. And you probably, if I hold it up, I don't know if you can see it, but actually what's really handy, I don't know if you can see those little lines, on this it's actually put a grid screen up. So that rule of thirds, it's actually on the screen to help me line everything up. And if you've got a digital camera, lots of digital cameras now, if you look through your menu settings, you can actually select something that in the viewfinder or on the screen at the back, it will draw that noughts and crosses grid for you to help you frame your pictures. So even if you're just using a phone, the standard camera on the phone probably won't have all of those settings. They're mainly just automatic. But if you go to your app store, whether it's Apple or if you use one of the other types of cameras, there are lots of free camera apps that you can download. If you type in something like manual camera, they'll come up, and choose one of the free ones, because what it means is you can actually then control some of the settings on your phone, and you'll be able to experiment as if you were using a full-sized camera. Okay. Finally, black and white. We of course see everything in colour, and we notice colours. One of the colours we often notice more than anything is red. If you will spot red quite quickly, which is why we use it as a warning sign, which is why you have red traffic lights or red brake lights. But once you take colour away and you've just got black and white, it's all gone. So it means that you have to think a bit carefully about the sort of pictures you're going to take. So let's say you're going on a walk, and you go on a walk and you're walking on one of the lovely footpaths round Handley, and then you see, say, what do they call? The violets are coming up. Bluebells are coming up at the moment. So some of the woods around here, they're flooded with bluebells. And of course, in colour, it looks spectacular because you've got all that green and that purple. But when you take a picture of all those bluebells with black and white, you will see nothing, because the greys between the bluebells and the greens is almost the same. Okay, so taking that kind of picture won't work. If you find snowdrops or white flowers, then of course that will show up. So the trick with black and white photography is you've got to stop looking at the colours that are in front of you, but you've got to look at the shadows and the light areas. So where you get bright areas and where you get shadow areas, that's what makes black and white photographs really good and really interesting. It does take a bit of time to train your eye and your brain to sort of think in black and white. The good thing about your camera phones or digital cameras is you can set your phone or your digital camera to shoot in black and white, which means when you look through the viewfinder or the screen at the back or your screen on your phone, you will see the image in black and white straight away. So you'll be able to see what it looks like, which is really helpful and a really good way to learn. But the trick is look for highlights and shadow areas. So for example, if you're walking along a footpath and you come to a bit and there's a line of trees, and the trees are causing lovely shadows across the footpath with dark areas and bright areas, and then you've got that footpath leading off into the distance, that will make a really interesting black and white photograph. And portraits, photographs of your family, friends, your pets, they also work really well in black and white. But what you need to do is make sure there's lots of nice bright lighting so you get shadows. If you look at my face now, what I've got is a shadow on this side and this side is a bit lighter. And if I open up the blinds in my study, it goes even more, you see. So on this side, it's very, that side it's very bright and the other side is very dark. So the trick with black and white photography is to try and forget about the colour and look for the dark areas, the shadows, and the bright areas, the highlights. And if you look for light, look at light and look at the way the light is falling on things, that's what makes for really interesting black and white pictures. So as I say, these sheets, I've put them as JPEGs on the Scout site. They're with the little advert that's there. And also I've asked Skip to email these out to you, so you should get these as well, which will be a helpful guide. So I hope over the next week, what I want you to do is to experiment with your aperture settings, experiment with your shutter speeds, learn a bit about ISO, and practice your composition and start thinking about black and white using shadows and highlights to take your photographs. If you've got a digital camera, a digital phone, take lots and lots of pictures. The more pictures you take, the better. Even though we're going to just end up with 6 pictures, they're going to be your 6 absolute best photographs. I hope before you get to those 6, you've taken hundreds of pictures and really experimented with all the different things and really starting to get some good pictures. So do experiment this week. Now, what I'm also going to do this week, and I'm going to post this up before our next sort of live broadcast next week, when we're going to look at how we edit our pictures in computer software and how we enhance them a bit. I am going to put up a film of how you develop a black and white film. So what I'm going to have is a roll of film like this. This is 120 film, if you remember. And I'm going to hand develop this black and white film in my kitchen, and I'm going to make a film of that so you can watch the wonder of how photography used to happen, when you used to use chemicals to create negatives. So I'll be putting a film up of that, hopefully before the end of the week, certainly before next Monday. That won't be live, it'll be a video which you can watch to give you some idea of how film gets processed. And then next Monday, we'll look at how we edit our pictures in editing software, either on our phones or on the computer, to enhance the pictures we've got before you then choose your final pictures and send them up to me, and then we're going to create a virtual gallery online. So Scouts, thanks for listening to me today. I hope you have some real fun over this week taking pictures. Experiment, practice as much as you can, and enjoy the photography. Get your parents involved with it as well, and I hope you have a good week taking pictures. All the best, Scouts. Take care.